Hello, this is a part 2. If you haven't watched the first part and you want to, then click the card in the top right of the screen. Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Jake the Genealogist, and in today's video, we're going to be doing a continuation of the previous video I made on the worst governors from each state. In this one, we're going to be going from Montana all the way over to Wyoming. And those are the ones we're going to be covering. But first, I just wanted to talk about this channel. So, thanks in part to a video by the excellent channel Useful Charts, my channel has really kind of blown up in the last 3 days. I now have more than tripled my subscriber count, which is absolutely crazy. And I just wanted to thank everyone new to this channel for all the wonderful support, and it really gives me a lot of motivation to keep making these kind of videos. Anyways, moving on, starting with Montana. So, starting with Montana, and the worst governor in Montana history is their 6th governor, Samuel Vernon Stewart, who served 2 terms. Now, this guy didn't do too much bad during his term, however, he did pass the Montana Sedition Act of 1918, which basically ended up causing hundreds of people to be arrested and about 79 of them to actually be convicted of speaking out against the U.S. participating in World War I. I'll provide a link in the description to a couple of the criminals' testimonies, which, I mean, they got convicted for pretty stupid reasons. However, during his term, the first ever female Congress member, Jeannette Rankin, was actually elected, and he also improved Montana's infrastructure by commissioning new highways. Moving on to Nebraska, we have our first governor, David Butler, who served for around 6 years before being impeached. Now, in spring 1871, Butler had 11 charges of impeachment actually brought against him, the first of which charged him with misappropriation of $16,000, or around $346,000 in today's money, from the state fund for schools and using it to buy plots of land in Lincoln. And he was removed from office in June of that same year, though the other 10 charges brought against him were actually dropped. However, later the state legislature actually reviewed his case in 1877 and removed the impeachment charges against him, thereby allowing him to run for state office again. However, that doesn't stop him from being arguably the worst governor in Nebraska history. And moving on to Nevada, we have their 3rd governor, John Henry Kincaid, who served for 1 term. Now, for Nevada, Nevada really gave me a lot of trouble. I had to look really far and wide before finding a bad governor there. But I actually found a quote from Kincaid's inaugural speech, actually from a primary source from the 1880s, of him opposing Chinese immigration. He stated, "We of this coast have, by years of unfortunate experience, come to realize and condemn the suicidal policy, which encourages or tolerates the influx of this uncivilized race. With its burden of moral and physical corruption, Chinese immigration unrestricted signifies Chinese domination in every department of labor in which cheap handiwork can compete with our own labor." Now, later this guy was actually elected as the governor of a completely different place, the District of Alaska. However, he actually resigned from the post after a mining scandal. Now, hopefully after adding this racist quote on Wikipedia, his legacy might be different in the future. Moving on to New Hampshire, we have their 63rd governor, Styles Bridges, who served 1 term. Now, this guy was actually the youngest governor in the country at the time of taking office in 1935. Now, there's a slight caveat here. So, he really didn't do much during his actual gubernatorial term. It was actually really after his term that his worst behavior started, when he got actually elected senator of the state. Now, he, like previously mentioned Maine Governor Owen Brewster, was actually a big defender of Joseph McCarthy, and was one of 22 senators who was actually against censoring McCarthy's Red Scare and Lavender Scare policies. He was also quoted as saying that the U.S. State Department needed a first-class cyanide fumigating job when they questioned the hurry to carry out Operation Paperclip, an operation where the U.S. actually employed many former Nazi Party members to help them design rockets and missiles to basically give them the upper hand in the Cold War. On top of that, he and several others actually blackmailed Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt into literally committing suicide in 1954, and he later actually tried to prosecute Hunt's son for being gay. So yeah, even though he didn't do much during his term, he's still a very bad person, and always has been, and always will. Moving on to New Jersey, we have their 17th governor, Rodney McCamley Price, who served one term. Now, this guy was actually pro-slavery, which is pretty hard to believe in a state like New Jersey. He was heavily opposed to any kind of civil war. He urged New Jerseyans not to go to war against the South, and actually insisted that slavery was not evil. The list goes on. Besides that, he actually insisted, in 1861, that New Jersey should actually secede from the Union and join the Confederacy, and frequently called President Lincoln a traitor. Besides this, he was a complete crook, actually stealing money from his own mother, swindling money in a land deal in California, and being arrested and put in jail for contempt of court in the last year of his life. You can read Notorious New Jersey, pages 29 to 33, to find out more. One good thing that he did do during his term was actually really kind of establish a public school system, hence why he is known really as the father of the public school system in New Jersey, really laying the groundwork for that. But overall, just a pretty bad dude. Moving on to New Mexico, we have their 15th, 17th, and 19th governor, Edwin L. Mesham, who served 4 terms. Now, known as Big Ed, he actually has no relation to a governor I previously mentioned, Evan Mesham, the governor of Arizona. Their names are spelled slightly differently. But they were both the worst governors in their state. Now, this guy wasn't that bad compared to Evan Mesham, if you know what he did. Basically, this guy just voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, despite the very high Hispanic population in his state, stating states' rights as his reason. And that's pretty much all he did. Moving on to New York, we have the 39th governor, William Sulzer, who served for 9 months before being impeached. Now, this guy was a member of the infamous political machine Tammany Hall, and he was very much a populist, actually renaming the executive mansion to the People's House. Surprisingly, he actually disobeyed many of Tammany Hall's demands during his term, actually causing them to really turn against him. Now, convictions of perjury were actually brought against him, coming from a lawsuit in 1890 due to his involvement in many fraudulent companies in Cuba, as well as Sulzer being rumored to actually have been sued for breaking a marriage promise with a Philadelphia woman. Now, in May 1913, Tammany Hall actually brought charges against him, accusing him of actually using his campaign contributions to actually buy stocks, though many have really questioned if Tammany Hall was just using this to get him out of their way. Nevertheless, his attempts to really prove himself innocent actually failed, as he was officially removed from office in October. Now, he remains a pretty controversial figure, as many over the years have actually tried to overturn his impeachment charges, but have really failed every single time. Moving on to North Carolina, we have their 50th governor, Charles Brantley Aycock, who served 1 term. Now, besides his unfortunate name, he was pretty bad. Before his governorship, he was very much involved in white supremacy campaigns in the state, actually being heavily involved in the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, actually to date the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. Now, during his campaign for governor in 1899, his supporters actually showed off guns from the insurrection, and Aycock appeared pretty often with the Red Shirts, a white supremacist terrorist group. He won with 60% of the vote, but that's likely due to widespread voter fraud throughout the state. Now, he did promote both white and black public schools, earning him the moniker the Education Governor, but he likely did this so he could just continue disenfranchising African Americans and not really get in trouble. Now, his speech in 1903, titled The Negro Problem, really shows off his blatant racism towards African Americans. I'll put a link in the description if you want to read it. And on top of that, there's actually a colossal list of places which have actually removed Aycock's name because of his awful racism. Now, funnily enough, he actually died of a heart attack in the middle of a speech in 1912, which just fascinates me. I mean, how many other politicians has that happened to? Nevertheless, he was just straight up bad and racist. Really not much else to say. Moving on to North Dakota, we have their 17th and 21st governor, William Langer, who served 2 terms. Now, this guy was a member of the Nonpartisan League Party, basically a faction of the Republican Party in the state. Now, in 1934, charges were actually brought against him, accusing him of trying to defraud the federal government, and he was ordered to be removed from office. So, what does he do? Does he acknowledge it? Nope, he actually refused, and according to Wikipedia, gathered with about 10 friends, declared North Dakota independent, declared martial law, and barricaded himself in the governor's mansion until a Supreme Court would meet with him. However, he actually later acknowledged his removal and let his Lieutenant Governor Olson actually serve for the remainder of his term. However, he actually later ran again in 1936 and won another term, so there you go. But he definitely remained one of the most colorful figures in North Dakota history. That's for sure. No wonder he was known as Wild. But moving on to Ohio, we have the 53rd Governor, Martin L. Davey, who served for 2 terms. Now, despite this guy being a Democrat, he actually fervently opposed Roosevelt's New Deal because of states' rights, of course. And as a result, he was actually charged with corruption, but the charges were later dropped. His opposition actually caused many Ohioans not to really receive any aid that they needed during the Great Depression. However, he actually did help out by giving unemployment compensation and improved funding for schools. He dealt with the Little Steel Strike of 1937 in a very questionable manner, actually sending in the National Guard to stop the strikers. Became pretty controversial. And to add, he actually got the campaign support from noted anti-Catholic, anti-Semite, and KKK member Gerald L.K. Smith, and he welcomed it greatly. So, just overall, this guy did a lot of bad things, kind of a mixed bag of sorts. Moving on to Oklahoma, we have their 7th governor, Henry S. Johnston, who served for 2 years before being impeached. Now, this guy actually started out his term by doing some good, establishing a hospital for crippled children, and actually increasing the school aid fund in the state. However, many complaints actually started to rise about Johnston being too controlled by his private secretary, one Mrs. O.O. Hammonds, with accusations going as far as her actually deciding legislative decisions and appointments for him. State officials actually recommended her resignation from her post. Things got hairy when the Oklahoma State House of Representatives began trying to impeach Johnston, ignoring policies put in place by court case Simpson v. Hill. The courts finally agreed to the hearings, but actually sided with the governor, only giving him more popularity for not intervening in any way. However, later they actually brought a second wave of impeachment charges against him, and in this case they actually removed him from office. Now, the reason this guy is pretty bad is because of his weakness and ineffectualness. In fact, during the early days of Oklahoma, most governors really held little power, this guy being probably the most extreme case, with the other 2 branches of government in the state holding way more power. And also, he's on here because, he literally got controlled by, like, a puppet. And it's just pretty sad. Moving on to Oregon, we have our 21st governor, Charles Henry Martin, who served for 1 term. Now, I have dubbed this guy the de facto fascist dictator of Oregon, because that's basically how he ran the state. So, to give some background, he was a big-time military guy serving in the Spanish-American and the Filipino-American Wars, as well as the Boxer Rebellion. He was also a big-time racist. In fact, he was actually responsible for a report given to the U.S. Army, which actually recommended the disenfranchisement of African-American troops, and forbidded them to actually reach certain ranks in the military, so they wouldn't be venerated as heroes. Check it out more in the link in the description. He was elected in 1934 after retiring from the military 7 years before. He was governor during the Great Depression, and he actually did some good things, like restoring the state's finances, constructing the Bonneville Dam, and improving infrastructure in the state. Then, satisfied with his attempts to actually lessen unemployment, ordered the federal government to stop giving relief funds to the state. Yeah. However, he later actually became well known as a pro-business governor. In 1935, when some timber workers went on strike, he declared that these pestiferous peewees would go to any lengths to embarrass me and my administration. He called the members of the labor unions in the state Bolsheviks and gangsters, and the first ever woman/LGBTQ member of the cabinet, Frances Perkins, had read in Roosevelt's administration. He went on to actually threaten the firing of Sheriff Oscar Weed of Columbia County for not beating striking workers enough. He instructed the sheriffs of the state to crack their damn heads and beat hell out of them, and frequently called the National Guard in to break up strikes. He was just a really nice guy. And though he was a Democrat, he vehemently opposed Roosevelt and his New Deal, becoming the main enemy of labor leaders across the state, which actually eventually cost him his renomination for the Democrats in 1938. And finally, like the funniest thing I just read about him, during the dedication of the new state capitol building in 1938, with the president in the audience, Martin yelled, "Get back, you bastards!" at the crowd waiting to enter the building. And to add, this was just a month before him actually deciding to run for re-election. That sure got him very many supporters. So just overall, this guy is the American equivalent of Benito Mussolini. Moving on to Pennsylvania, we have William Bigler, their 12th governor who served for the state for one term. Now, fun fact, he and his brother named John were actually the first siblings to be governors of different states at the same time. Now, the reason this guy is bad is because he pretty much only wanted to really appease the South. He supported the Walker Tariff, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and frequently enforced the Fugitive Slave Act in his state. And as senator, he advocated for the statehood of Kansas under the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. And that's basically it. Moving on to Rhode Island, we have their 70th governor, Edward DePreedy, who served for 3 terms. Now, this guy is basically known only as a criminal, however, he's still actually alive at 86 years old. So, to run for his crimes, in 1994, he was convicted of charges related to giving out state contracts during his time as governor, though these were later dismissed. He got charged again and pled guilty in 1998 on charges of racketeering, extortion, and bribery, and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. And he admitted to accepting and exchanging $250,000 in a plea bargain for state contracts, and because of this, his retirement pension was taken away, and he served 11 months in a correctional facility. However, he was known, according to Wikipedia, for his everyman persona. He apparently served passerby supermarket fried chicken from his motorhome, and during a snowstorm, he invited members of the Rhode Island State House to actually come inside, so they could actually finish up their work. Still a pretty big crook, though. Moving on. And moving on to South Carolina, we have their 84th governor, Benjamin Tillman, who served for 2 terms. Now, to start, this guy was a white supremacist who participated in the aforementioned Red Shirts terrorist group during the particularly violent 1876 election. He defended lynching and even boasted about killing African Americans on the floor of the U.S. Senate. He did absolutely nothing about lynchings, except at the beginning of his term for some reason, except he kind of stopped that. In fact, there was no lynchings in the first year of his term, but then he was just kind of relaxed on it, and then 18 of them happened in the remaining 3 years in his office. Right off the bat, as soon as he got elected, he clearly stated that his intentions were for African Americans not even to get a single role in politics in his state. And along with that, he got in many feuds with the president, Grover Cleveland, on the issue of free silver, actually calling him an old bag of beef. Real genteel. But his real legacy really lied in the 1895 South Carolina Constitution, which basically impacted African Americans and poor whites for decades after, ensuring the Democratic Party's stranglehold over South Carolina, just like in the rest of the Solid South. Moving on to South Dakota, we have their 27th and 30th governor, Bill Janklow, or Yanklow, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, who served for 4 terms. Now, this guy has had many mishaps in his life. When he was 16, he was actually arrested for sexually assaulting a 17-year-old girl, and then was later found firing a gun at a water tower. Wonderful. He was later elected in 1978 to become the state's governor, and he won easily for re-election in 1982 with a 70.2% majority, actually the highest in the state's history. One of the things he actually decided to do was to reinstate capital punishment, something that's still a pretty contentious issue nowadays, so moving on. And he also decided that he wanted to get rid of the Department of Environmental Protection in the state, possibly because of their connection with the Sioux tribe's attempts to actually stop development in their cultural homeland, the Black Hills. Now, in 2003, after he was governor, he was actually involved in a fatal situation. When he was speeding on a highway, he actually hit a motorcyclist, killing them instantly, and caused himself many bodily injuries. He was sentenced to 100 days in jail for second-degree manslaughter. And on top of that, he's had many, many other incidents throughout his life, such as the alleged rape of 15-year-old Lakota schoolgirl. And just, overall, he's just a bad person. And moving on to Tennessee, we have their 17th governor, William G. Brownlow, who served for 2 terms. Now, this guy became the first Reconstruction-era governor in Tennessee, nominated right after the end of the Civil War. And under his watch, Tennessee actually became the first state to leave the Confederacy, and Brownlow began putting into place many reforms in the state that would stop the growing Ku Klux Klan movement and give rights to African Americans. Good thing, right? He aligned himself with the radical Republicans and did a lot to actually try to disenfranchise former Confederate soldiers in the state, just like many other radical Republican governors, actually following in the footsteps of his predecessor, future President Andrew Johnson. Now, that may sound good, but in some cases he actually went too far with this, such as where he erased almost 1/3 of the vote in the state congressional election of 1866 to actually allow fellow radical Republican candidate Samuel Arnell to actually win his district. And through his many attempts to actually stop the KKK, the violence actually only increased in the state, unfortunately, coming to a point where they even sent Brownlow a death threat personally, the actual leader of the KKK. And he, once again, in 1868, threw out many votes in the state's counties using Klan intimidation as his explanation so that several allies in his party could win. And near the end of his term, he also placed 9 counties under martial law so he could attempt to quell Klan violence. And so, what makes this guy so bad is, overall, on the surface, he did a lot of good things to try to actually help African Americans and try to calm down the KKK movement, which really just started during his term in Tennessee. However, he really kind of failed at it. He didn't do a good job at all, and he remains a controversial figure to this day, with many actually calling him the most hated man in Tennessee history, and a poll ranking all 52 governors in the state actually placing him dead last. Moving on to Texas, we have their 6th governor, Hardin Richard Runnels, who served for 1 term. Now, fun fact, he was actually the only person ever to have defeated war hero Sam Houston in a political battle, so there you go. Now, the 2 main concerns at the beginning of Reynolds' term was slavery and protecting Western settlers. Now, to address the slavery issue, he actually signed a bill that allowed for a freed slave to actually select a new master, as if they'd actually want to return to slavery, And he also tried to convince the state legislature to actually support the revival of the African slave trade. Yeah, that African slave trade. Now, on the issue of Western settlers, he actually got the state militia to wage several unwarranted battles against the Comanches and Mexican bandits, respectively. However, these really didn't help at all. The only half-decent thing he did was actually not support railroads. He actually recognized that they were kind of corrupt, and didn't really give them very many financial benefits. But other than that, pretty terrible. Moving on to Utah, we have their 3rd governor, William Spry, who served for 2 terms. Now, a strong opponent of prohibition, Spry shot down several bills that would have enforced it. However, the main reason he's actually on this list is for one very controversial thing. So, to give some background, in 1914, famous Swedish-American songwriter and labor activist Joe Hill was actually convicted of murdering a father and son who were grocers in a pretty highly controversial case, and he was sentenced to die by the electric chair. And by 1915, this case had received national attention, so much so that everyone from the likes of Helen Keller to then-President Woodrow Wilson wrote letters to Spry urging him to pardon Hill. However, in the end, he ended up refusing, and Joe Hill was executed. And so unfortunately, this is really the only thing that Spry is remembered for nowadays. He did do some good things during his term, like stopping child labor and actually prohibiting minors from using tobacco. But it's mostly this one reason why he's on this list. Moving on to Vermont, we have their 63rd Governor Charles Manley Smith, who served for 2 years before dying in office. Now, to give some context, before his governorship in 1920, he actually became the president of Marble Savings Bank, something that definitely plays into his story, and he kept this post through his governorship. Now, during his term in 1936, right in the middle, he and several others working at the bank were actually charged with fraud for actually keeping secret and embezzlement by the bookkeeper there. It actually turns out in 1932, Smith found out that the bookkeeper at the bank he worked at had actually stolen $251,000, and he really didn't report it to anyone. He was later acquitted for this scandal, but as the New England Historical Society called him, he was certainly Vermont's bank-robbing governor. During his term, he actually did do some good things, however, helping his state through the Great Depression by actually implementing old-age pensions and compensation for those who were unemployed. And moving on to Virginia, we have their 41st Governor, Philip McKinney, who served for one term. Now, the primary focus of this guy's campaign was really, once again, like many other Southern governors, on white supremacy and the threat of African Americans' advancement. Now, his focus during his term was a little bit different. He actually wanted to improve the struggling economy and actually make the Democratic Party in Virginia more powerful. However, his worst moment actually came at the unveiling of the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond back in 1890, a monument which has actually recently made the news after being torn down in midst of many Black Lives Matter protests just last year. And however, there was a much different feeling 130 years ago. Even though the Civil War was long since over, most people there, including McKinney himself, actually remarked that how Lee was like a fallen hero, and the crowd cheered when it was unveiled. Moving on to Washington State, and the worst governor there is their 12th and 14th Governor, Arthur B. Langley, who served for 2 terms. Now, the reason why this guy is so bad is pretty much for one reason: his attitude towards the Japanese people, specifically the internment of the Japanese people, something he was both for and actively supported. He passed through legislation banning Japanese citizens from both owning firearms and going to certain areas in public, and also had the FBI and immigration officers treat all who were evacuated very harshly. Now, this fear-mongering eventually spread across the state, as many parents in Gatewood, a neighborhood in Seattle, actually protested the employment of many Japanese clerks working in the schools and wrote letters to newspapers. And unlike many governors when FDR actually issued the executive order, Langley did not resist it. And though many in public stated that quite a few reasons why Japanese Americans shouldn't be systematically taken from their homes to internment camps, Langley didn't budge once. However, he did do a couple good things, I suppose. He did improve some environmental protection measures and establish a ferry system for the state. But what he did to all of these poor Japanese citizens in his state is just unspeakable. And moving on to West Virginia, and the worst governor in that state's history is our 18th governor, William Gustavus Conley, who served for one term. Now, Conley's term started right at the beginning of the Great Depression and a major drought, and his term was undoubtedly during some of the worst times in West Virginia's history. Now, he's mainly on here because of his ineffectualness. His opinion on how to fix the state during the Great Depression was questionable at best. He believed in what he called government paternalism, meaning essentially the government should be allowed to interfere with people's everyday lives, basically in order to improve them. However, later he actually changed his mind and went on the path of promoting initiatives to combat inequality and actually expand the economic opportunity of the state, pretty much something unheard of for a Republican governor. And by the time the 1930 legislative elections results were in, the Democrats actually won the majority for the first time in the state's history, pretty much making Conley a lame duck, essentially, for the rest of his term. Then he once again switched his policy, this time for the final time, and this time around he promoted actual direct relief for those in need of food and jobs. However, these adjustments did not gain him any support whatsoever from the Democrats of the state. So yeah, he just, during one of the worst times in West Virginia's history, his ineffectualness was bad. However, he is better than some governors, I'll give him that, for actually wanting to change plans, for his willingness to actually do something else, as evidenced by the fact that he changed his plan for how to fix the state on 3 different occasions. Moving on to Wisconsin now, the worst governor in Wisconsin history is their 5th governor, Coles Bashford, who served for 1 term. Now, during his term, the only slightly notable thing that Bashford actually did was appoint the very first African-American office holder in the state, so that's pretty cool. However, just a few weeks after Bashford's term ended, an investigation was actually started in response to claims that Bashford and other members in his administration actually accepted bribes from a railroad company in exchange for, you guessed it, a land grant. Now, Bashford actually got $50,000 worth of stocks and $15,000 in cash from the deal, the most of anyone involved. Now, politicians involved actually tried to burn the reports, however, the public outrage did actually not die down. He was actually never caught for this scandal. He actually just cashed in his stocks and fled the state for the Arizona Territory by 1863. So yeah, moving on. And moving on to the very final state, Wyoming. And the worst governor in Wyoming history is their 18th governor, Nels Hansen Smith, who served for 1 term. Now, he's on here for one reason, or more specifically, one comment, yet again speaking out against Japanese Americans. So here's the comment. So in 1942, in response to a proposal to relocate Japanese Americans to Wyoming, Smith told Milton Eisenhower, Dwight's younger brother, that if you bring any Japs into my state, they will be hanging from every tree. Yeah. And that about wraps it up for this video. So thank you guys for watching. I wanted to just give a little bit of credit to my friend, who will remain nameless, for assisting me in picking out some of the governors in this video, specifically part 2. And one thing I've learned, I guess, from this video is that there was a lot of racist governors. There's a lot of really terrible governors, and there's a lot of states that really didn't have any bad governors at all. A lot of states where it's really, really, really hard to pick out governors. It literally took me 2 or 3 hours to really just look through every single governor and just really decide. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Thank you to 150 or so new subscribers. I've now reached the 200 subscriber mark, in the process of actually making this video, and see you guys all later. Goodbye.